This lecture then is about problems that you can have with your stomach. So to begin with then, there is what is called gastritis. And this kind of tells you what the problem is when you see gast or gaster. That's going to have to do with the stomach. Where you see itis, that basically means some kind of an inflammation, often an infection. So gastritis then is specifically inflammation of the gastric mucosa. Now you know what the mucosa is. That is the first 2 or 3 innermost layers of the GI tract. Remember, that's the mucosa, the mucous membrane. So as I said, here we are seeing the mucosa in the stomach, or gastric mucosa. And when that becomes inflamed, that is known as gastritis. Okay, so what happens then? Well, first of all, this can be from many different things. This is a descriptive term then. So it can be caused by drugs, including alcohol or aspirin. These can lead to irritation and inflammation of the lining of the stomach. It can also happen because of either acid or alkaline chemicals. And even stress and bacterial infection. Then of the gastric wall can also produce it. Okay, next problem is the problem of gastric ulcers. Actually, I'm going to make that peptic ulcers just to be specific here, or to be general. I'll get to the specifics in a moment. So, a peptic ulcer then. This is very important to understand now. So this then is when digestive enzymes and acids then erode their way through the stomach or small intestine. So what's going on here? What's going on is this. Your stomach is full of digestive enzymes and acids. So is your small intestine. Those things break down food. The problem is that because your stomach and small intestine are also made out of flesh, it means that therefore those acids and enzymes are capable of eroding their way out of your stomach, basically eroding the tissues of your stomach and eroding the tissues of your small intestine, essentially eating their way out of your GI tract. We don't want this to happen, but it sometimes does. That's what a peptic ulcer is. Normally, we have a lining of mucus that is secreted by the lining of the GI tract that keeps these acids and digestive chemicals away from the wall of our GI tract. And on top of that, we have that epithelial lining, and epithelial cells are replaced very, very frequently. So we usually wind up being protected from the acids and the digestive chemicals in our stomach and small intestine, but not always. So every now and then you can wind up with a particular small portion of the stomach or small intestine where there's some kind of an irritation that then allows the digestive chemicals to get in and start eroding the wall of the intestine or the wall of the stomach. So then a gastric ulcer is when you have this kind of an ulcer. An ulcer is basically an eroded portion, a small hole or irritated area. That's what a gastric ulcer is, and then the same thing in the first part of the small intestine then is known as a duodenal ulcer. So this then is found in the initial part of the small intestine, which is the part that is known as the duodenum. Now, normally these are just small areas that are being attacked basically by these acids and digestive chemicals, but they haven't eaten their way all the way through. On the other hand, if you get a perforated ulcer, that means that they have wound up eroding their way all the way through the wall of the GI tract, and now you are in serious trouble. So, if these acids and other chemicals then erode right through the GI tract and into the peritoneal cavity. Now you're in trouble if this happens, because at this point you wind up having free passage from your GI tract, whatever is in your GI tract, into your abdomen, which is supposed to be sterile. And so you have all of these other things suddenly being introduced into that. This basically is fatal unless corrected. And so this then must be corrected. And this then requires surgical correction. If you actually have a hole going all the way through, you've got to go in and you've got to sew up the hole. Now, one thing that you need to understand about ulcers is that we used to think that ulcers were caused by, stress or spicy foods or things like that. We now know that ulcers, where we have, as I said, these areas that get irritated because the acids and the digestive chemicals are getting there, those initial irritations are actually caused by bacteria. This is a case where we thought for a long time that because the stomach environment is so harsh with all those acids and those digestive chemicals, we genuinely thought that bacteria could not live in the stomach. But then we found that bacteria did live in the stomach. They can live in the stomach. There's a particular kind of bacteria that can do this. And so what happened was that we noticed that when people were given courses of antibiotics, then sometimes their ulcers went away. And then when we started getting equipment, which I will tell you about in a moment, where we could actually take samples of tissue from inside the stomach, basically while the stomach is intact, and we could just take a sample from right where the ulcer is, it turned out that bacteria were always present in those samples. So we slowly wound up figuring out that this bacteria, known as Helicobacter pylori, we found that these bacteria are the things that actually cause the ulcer itself. And then once it's there, of course, we wind up having the stomach acid and the digestive chemicals irritating it and causing further erosion. But the initial problem is caused by a bacterial infection. I hope this is making sense. So as I said, this means that, let's say you have stress or you have spicy food, that then will lead to the ulcers hurting because you do have this irritated area. So what happens then is that we have the initial cause of the ulcers, then is a bacterial infection of what is called Helicobacter pylori. So this is a bacteria. That's how it all gets started. As I said, once it's started, the acids also work their way in there. It hurts. You can get further problems. I hope this is making sense. So I told you that we started finding bacteria in samples that were specifically taken from the ulcer-affected areas of the stomach lining. So to do that, we used a piece of equipment that's useful for you to know about as well. And this is called a Gastroscope. And this then is an instrument that allows visual inspection of the inside of the stomach. So what happens is that basically a small fiber optic cable, essentially a tiny camera, is placed in the esophagus and it goes down into the stomach, and the doctors can then basically watch the interior of your stomach on TV, and they can then look around and they can see if things look the way they should or not. And so they can look for cancer cells. It's a good way of looking for stomach cancer. They can also look for ulcers. And this tiny little camera can then be steered over to the area with the possible cancer cells or the ulcer cells. And a small sample of tissue can be taken right from that area. So as I said, here you can basically see the interior of your stomach on TV. And this is good for checking for, among other things, gastric cancer. Let's see, gastric cancer. You can find gastric cancer that well as well that way, as well as also checking out somebody's ulcers, looking for other problems as well. And getting back to Helicobacter pylori, as well as the cancer, you can also then get samples of tissue that can be taken this way. I will simply say too, by using an attachment. So you can actually then get a sample of tissue right from the area that looks difficult or dangerous in some way or another, that has these unusual features, unusual tissue, unusual looking cells. So what's going to happen in this case, this is where the field of histology comes in. They take a sample, let's say from something that looks like it could be stomach cancer. They can bring it up and then culture those cells in a lab, take a good look at them under a microscope, and you've learned from histology that cells have different looks. And part of the field of pathology then is being able to tell healthy tissue, which you learned about in histology, from unhealthy tissue, such as cancer cells. They really do look different. And in that way, you will be able to assess whether someone has stomach cancer or not, for example. So let's say that the person has stomach cancer. A treatment of stomach cancer may involve what is called gastrectomy, which is the removal of all or part of the stomach. And that is it for stomach problems.